Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Hello. Wonderful to see everyone, and we are going to get started. So let me start by first welcoming all of you to the Michigan Safety and Justice Roundtable. We're so happy to have you here. My name is Melanca Clark. I'm the president and CEO of the Hudson-Webber Foundation. We are a private grant-making foundation based here in Detroit. Our origins go back to 1939 in this city. We're based on the visionary philanthropy of Richard Webber, and that foundation is on the legacy of the Hudson and Webber families that ran the J.L. Hudson department stores. So we're so pleased to be here. So let me tell you a little bit about our foundation and what we're thinking about in bringing us together today. So our mission is to improve the quality of life in Detroit. And we are specifically interested in helping ensure that the recovery here in Detroit is inclusive and enduring. And for us to be able to be about that business, we have to really identify and support those strategies that intentionally connect people to opportunity. And then on the converse side, really identify and address those structural barriers that impede progress for so many Detroiters, because we are focused on Detroit. So in advancing that particular mission, we've had to contend with the reality that one of those structural barriers to opportunity is involvement with the juvenile justice system. So I'm not going to throw a bunch of data. We actually have some time for that later in the day. But I think it's enough to say that, historically, when you look at juvenile justice involvement, when we look at our young people, what has happened as we look over the past decades is that when they've got contact with the juvenile justice system, when they are institutionalized, that intervention point has not been an intervention point that puts folks on a pathway to opportunity. In fact, quite to the contrary, it is, in effect, an intervention that's leading to bad outcomes for life, economically, socially, and even in terms of crime. So that's something that we have our eye on and that we care about, given the larger goals that we have here. So what I do want to acknowledge, certainly, there's been progress nationally and there's been progress in the state around these issues, and certainly around, and if you look at particular counties in the state, some real progress on the deinstitutionalization of youth, on expanding community-based care, and I want to acknowledge that progress. But I also want to say, and I'm borrowing words here from a former colleague of mine, the former administrator of the Office of Juvenile Justice, Delinquency and Prevention Office, Robert Listenby, but to say that we cannot say yet with conviction that across the state that our kids, that their contact with the juvenile justice system is rare, is fair, and is beneficial. We cannot say that with conviction. We are not there yet. So to really move the needle, what we need are interventions and policy reforms that are informed by evidence, that are equitable, that promote youth development, and that are in turn more likely to promote and lead us to better public safety. That is the urgent work at hand, and that's why we're here. So to provide a little context, I'm a lawyer by training. Before coming to Hudson-Webber, I spent 6 years at the Justice Department and at the White House, and several years before that as an advocate working on various aspects of criminal and juvenile justice reform. And one thing I learned over that time, and particularly with my work with the Obama administration, is the true power of convening, of getting people together in a room, hashing out these problems and trying to find a common path forward. And unfortunately, these opportunities to come together are rather rare for a variety of reasons. And so sitting at the perch of the foundation and thinking about the tools that we have in our toolbox, the one, of course, most folks are familiar with is you give out money, and yes, we do. But another tool that we have in our toolbox is bringing people together. And that's what we wanted to do here, and we are so pleased to be doing this with the Michigan Committee on Juvenile Justice. And so I'd say, because these opportunities to come together are rare, we have fashioned this day, I think you might have noticed just looking at the agenda, as something different than a typical conference. This is, in fact, an anti-conference. We have invited you here to get some work done. So we don't have, we have a very limited number of speakers, of talking heads like myself, that are here to sort of welcome you and frame the day. But really, we are asking you to do some important work. We've been really deliberate about who we've brought together today. You are all from different parts of this system. You have different vantage points and different perspectives. We've tried to really curate a group of experts with insights and expertise that can really do a deep dive, and we'll be having small group sessions later in the day where, again, no talking heads. You guys will be at a round table, and we will be asking all of you for your input on common challenges, on opportunities, on what's underway. But also, and most significantly, we are asking you to identify concrete action items that can advance the field. So, to state the obvious, November is around the corner. We've got a set of elections in front of us, and from a state perspective, a real opportunity here to elevate these issues, and also, based on the work that's done here today, to generate some action items that can be a roadmap to effective and equitable solutions for our young people. So again, I am so pleased to welcome you, so happy to have you here. And so grateful that you, by your showing up and participating, have taken on this challenge to do this important work today. So before I introduce and pass this over to my co-host, Justice Mary Beth Kelly, I wanted to take a point of privilege first to recognize several Hudson-Webber trustees that are in the room. I know my board chair, Jenny Hudson-Park, is here. I see Amanda Van Dusen, who's our board secretary and personnel chair. And at some point, I know we're going to be joined by the Venerable Joe Hudson, former board chair of the foundation and trustee emeritus. And I just want to thank them for their support for this work. I also, for those, we are live streaming these proceedings, and so for folks out in the intranet, and for those in the room, our hashtag for today is #MIJustice, so you can tweet and such. So let me, with that, take the opportunity to introduce Justice Mary Beth Kelly. Her bio, of course, is in the materials that we provided, but I did want to take the opportunity to really highlight her longstanding commitment to juvenile justice issues. So Justice Kelly maintained a juvenile docket for close to 10 years as a circuit court judge in Wayne County, and then as the first woman and chief judge of the Wayne County Court, where she implemented a teenage runaway docket that focused on youth at risk of victimization. Once elected to the Michigan Supreme Court in 2010, Justice Kelly has universally been recognized in that role as a champion for young people. She's now a mediator and arbiter, but continues her commitment to these issues. She's a visiting judge at the Wayne County Circuit Court. She, of course, is the co-chair of this committee, which we'll get to hear about in a moment. And as director of Vista Mara, she is, in fact, a director of Vista Mara, which is a service provider for young women involved in the child welfare and juvenile justice systems. So I'm going to turn it over to Justice Mary Beth Kelly. And with that, thank you.
Thank you. Again, I repeat Melanca's thank you to all of you for taking your time. Each of you come from different spheres, but you have a passion for juvenile justice, and that unites us. I want to assure you that the work you do today will inform the work that the Michigan Committee on Juvenile Justice undertakes. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Michigan Committee on Juvenile Justice, we are a group of 20 individuals appointed by the governor, and we represent various stakeholder groups within the juvenile justice system. The MCJJ, as we call ourselves, we have several federally mandated functions. So, for example, we administer and disperse the Title II funds that the state receives from the federal government. In the last several years, that's been in the $900,000 range. We also ensure compliance with those requirements, for example, institutions which detain youth. We ensure their compliance with the federal laws that govern that. We also, in addition to these federally mandated functions, Back in 2015, we identified 5 focus groups that we intended our work to primarily focus on. And these 5 areas, many of which you will address today, are diversion, data collection, augmenting or having more, the creation of more juvenile mental health courts throughout the state, our continued commitment to school justice, and finally, support for the Raise the Age legislation, which was once introduced in Michigan. It did not pass, but we did support that through testimony at the hearings and through providing data. We continue to support the Raise the Age legislation by working with the group that is trying to monetize the effect on the counties, which was really the downfall of that legislation last time. We are a group of, I think, tremendously talented persons. Some of our key members of the MCJJ are here today. I want to introduce them in just a moment. We have meetings that are open to the public. Melanca graced us with her presence at our June meeting. Our next meeting is October 1st, and if any of you would like to come and learn more about what we do, please feel free to attend that meeting. We also maintain a very robust website. It's not very creative in its name, MichiganCommitteeForJuvenileJustice.com, but it provides statistical reports and really learned studies, not just from our state, but from other states, so that we can benefit from the intelligence on juvenile justice and the progress on juvenile justice in other states. So again, I invite you to look at that. At our June meeting, we passed a resolution, a formal resolution, supporting the raising the age of criminal prosecution in Michigan to 18. As most of you know, we're one of 4 states that have yet to do that. We presented that to the governor, and it was warmly received by the governor's office. He pointed out that in his special message on juvenile justice, his special message on on justice reform, excuse me, he indicated that, quote, we cannot expect progress in our communities without advancing the cause of our children, end of quote. And he reminded that he has taken that issue very seriously. At our June meeting, we also committed that everything we do will touch upon the issue of the disproportional minority contacts, the DMC problem, which, again, as all of you know, our young people of color remain disproportionately overrepresented in our juvenile justice system. So that was another commitment that we made at our June meeting. As I indicated, there are members present that I would like to recognize. Nancy Becker-Bennett from the Michigan State Police, who is just entering the room. And Nancy heads the grants and community outreach on behalf of the Michigan State Police. We also have Jessica Black, who's one of our youth representatives and a social work student at the Central Michigan University. We have Melinda Fandel, who is our DHHS administrator, and she does an amazing job of administering all of our work. We have with us Terry Gilbert, who Terry is the Director of Operations at the Child and Adolescent Lab at the School of Social Work. One of the accomplishments, really, of the MCJJ on our data was through her and Joe Ryan, who I'll introduce shortly, the creation of this data collection lab. It collects data from court-available information, from education, so we can actually track the outcomes of our juvenile justice youth. On the child welfare side, of course, the child rights litigation forced that upon the state, but on the juvenile justice side, we did not have a mechanism to actually collect that data, and now we do. And so we're so happy to have Terry with us as well. We have Corey Haynes, who is the chief of police of the city of Madison Heights. He's also a Detroit Mercy Law student. Let's see, Daquan Harrison. I did not see him enter, but I'm sure he'll be here. Daquan is one of our youth members who's very, very engaged in all kinds of national youth platforms, and he's a great voice of Michigan in those platforms. We have Bob Higgins. I saw Bob Higgins. Bob Higgins is an education consultant, and he's vital to our work on school justice. We hold a biannual school justice forum, and Bob, again, is invaluable in that respect. We have Sarah McCauley. Sarah McCauley, who has a public policy consulting firm in Traverse City, and Sarah is as well a former policy advisor on juvenile justice to Governor Snyder, and again brings us a great perspective to the committee. I'd like to recognize Sandy Metcalf. So many of you know Sandy. Sandy is the the juvenile administrator, I should say, juvenile director of the 20th Circuit Court in Ottawa. She is our grants committee director at the MCJJ. She's also the founder of Juvenile Justice 2020, an organization that many of you are familiar with. Let's see. And then Dr. Joe Ryan, again, is a professor of social work at the University of Michigan, and the data lab was actually his brainchild through much collaboration with the state of Michigan, with the state administrator's office. He was able to successfully launch, and again, this has been a real game changer for the juvenile justice in Michigan to have the ability to collect data. Kenyatta Stevens. So Kenyatta is the Chief Operating Officer of Black Family Development, and as well, she is really a liaison with the committee for the Georgetown Juvenile Law Center. Has a pilot program going in Michigan in 3 counties, including Wayne County, and Kenyatta keeps us plugged into that. And again, that's great progress for our state to have the Georgetown Juvenile Law Center working in 3 different counties. We're almost done. So Thomas Weichel, I haven't seen him yet. Oh, there he is. Hi, Tom. So Tom is the elected prosecutor of Alcona, it's way up north, Alcona County. But Tom is a very, very passionate advocate of juvenile rights. And again, he brings a great perspective to the committee. Again, Tom is the elected prosecutor, not just the assisting prosecutor, so he kind of lets those under him share his vision. I'd also like to recognize some other elected officials who've joined us. From the Michigan Supreme Court, we have Justice Bridget McCormick. Many of you know Justice McCormick. She's had a long-standing commitment to juvenile justice as well as to justice issues in general. Prior to her election in 2012 to the Michigan Supreme Court, she was the director of the Innocence Project at the University of Michigan and remains a professor at the University of Michigan and continues to publish scholarly law articles. I'd also like to recognize Judge Frank Szymanski from the Wayne County Circuit Court. Frank is probably the most creative juvenile justice advocate that I know. He's done things like started yoga for at-risk kids, guitar for at-risk kids. He started the Care Straight program, as opposed to Scare Straight, of course, bringing young people, particularly young people at risk, into jails to actually have a dialogue with an inmate who committed a crime as a juvenile and is serving a very long sentence. I had the great opportunity to witness one of those sessions, and it was so, so moving. So we're happy to have Frank with us as well. And finally, it's my privilege to introduce to you Attorney Dana Nessel, who come November, of course, wants to be Attorney General, Dana Nessel. Dana is best known in legal circles for her representation in the Dubois versus Snyder case, which once consolidated by the Sixth Circuit, became the United States Supreme Court case which legalized same-sex marriage throughout the United States. Dana also has a civil rights foundation, which she co-founded with our Wayne County prosecutor, Kim Worthy. She's won virtually every significant award in the law in Michigan, including the State Bar of Michigan, Woman of the Year, the Michigan Lawyers Weekly, the Michigan Lawyers Weekly, she was the Woman of the Year. The State Bar of Michigan, she was the Champion of Justice. And Wayne State lauded her as the Treasure of Detroit. And so, again, rather than talk about Dana Nessel, I'd rather hand the mic over to her and let you hear from her. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice Kelly. Thank you so much for everyone who put this together. This is an amazing organization, and I'm really honored to be able to speak to all you here today. So yeah, I've done a lot of work in regard to civil rights, but what I have done more than anything else really in my career is practice criminal law. And I spent many years as a assistant prosecutor with the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office, serving under 3 administrations there. But unlike anyone else to hold this office in, I think, nearly a century, I also spent many years as a criminal defense attorney representing indigent defendants. And I really honestly think it's time to have someone in the Office of Attorney General that has sat at both tables and who truly understands the criminal justice system from both sides. We have spent a long time listening to politicians in our state, and specifically people who held the office of Attorney General, talk about being tough on crime, but we haven't been very smart on crime, have we? And we know that when it comes to matters of juvenile justice, we have been particularly unsavvy when it comes to making certain that juveniles who are offenders do not go on to become adults who are also offenders, who reoffend. And we know from recent reports from the Department of Justice, which has shed a lot of new light on recidivism by juvenile offenders, that, frankly, locking children up is not an effective form of deterrence. We know that, right? And this study that was done, I believe it's called Pathways to Dissidence. Is that the study that you're familiar with, I'm sure? I think there were 1,300 juvenile offenders that were studied over the course of 7 years after they were originally convicted. And some of the things that were learned from that were that handing out harsh sentences to children is not a deterrent for future criminal acts. And we know that Michigan is at the top of the list when it comes to handing out harsh sentences for juveniles. We had the second highest rate of juvenile offenders who were sentenced to life, non-parolable life sentences. And as you will recall, our current Attorney General spent a massive amount of time and energy and resources trying to ensure that that ruling by the United States Supreme Court that you could no longer sentence juveniles to life without parole, except for in rare circumstances, that would not be applied retroactively. But we have that situation in addition to the fact that, as was mentioned, we're one of the very few states in the nation that allows 17-year-olds to be sentenced as adults, to be tried as adults, and to exclusively be put into the adult criminal justice system. We also still place children into solitary confinement, which is not done in many places. So we know that all of these types of ways that we've been handling juvenile justice in this state are ineffective. And in fact, it has really the exact opposite effect. When we institutionalize juvenile offenders, it actually substantially increases the likelihood of them reoffending. And that removing children from the community, when you have that situation, the average was 2.5 times more in terms of future arrests per year compared to those who were sentenced to probationary terms. So locking up kids actually increased crime instead of preventing it. And what we know to be true also is this: when you have juveniles who are arrested and sentenced to probation, that actually serves as a greater deterrent than locking them up. But what we also know is that when you lock up juveniles, it actually increases the chance that there will be profound psychological and emotional damage to that juvenile, and that will result certainly in a poorer outcome later when those juveniles turn into adults. Let me speak for a second about the issue of these life sentences that we had for juveniles, because I do have personal experience with this. I have represented a number of people who were sentenced as 18-year-olds to parolable life for second-degree murder. And what the law used to be, this has since changed, but what it used to be is that if you wanted to seek parole when you received a parolable life sentence, you actually had to go before the sentencing judge or his or her successor to get permission to do so. And so I handled a number of those cases to try to get those individuals before the parole board. So I would have people who had committed, very heinous acts, committed murders when they were, say, 18 years old, and now it's 40 years later, and they are still trying to get before the parole board. So I had an opportunity to see what had happened to that individual from the time they were 18 to the time that maybe they were 55 or 60 or even 65. And to me, the notion that people who commit crimes as young people cannot be rehabilitated is simply outdated and honestly ridiculous, because I would see people who, again, in their 50s or 60s, these were individuals who had gone sometimes 30 or 40 years without a single disciplinary action taken against them while they were in the MDOC. These were people who went on to not just complete many college courses, but to be teaching them in the facilities in which they were incarcerated, and to be teaching things like anger management or substance abuse, or having literacy courses for other prisoners over the course of decades. And to say that it was important that they remain removed from society and that we pay some $35,000 to $40,000 a year to have them removed from society, we were not doing society any favors. And so when I look at the effort by a lot of county prosecutors to keep juveniles who were sentenced to life terms incarcerated for the rest of their lives, I simply I have a fundamental disagreement with the notion that most of those people still pose a threat to society. I just simply don't agree with that notion. And so there are a lot of things that I think that we need to be doing that I know have been discussed by people who are in this room right now. And I'm talking about things that we ought to really be propelling forward, things like diversionary programs for mental health issues, alcohol and drug issues, where we divert kids away from the criminal justice system and instead into treatment and away from a criminal record. We need to do more to broaden the expungement laws for instance, to allow people to have convictions set aside for things under the Motor Vehicle Code. Why can you get an unarmed robbery expunged? Why can you get an assault with intent to commit great bodily harm expunged, but not a driving while license suspended? Not a no proof of insurance. These saddle people for the rest of their lives unnecessarily. I don't understand it. We obviously need to reform the bail and bond system. There's no question about that. We know that when we lock people up for no reason other than that they are poor, that they have outcomes that are worse than if they were given a bond and were allowed to remain out in the community, and that we are not increasing the risk to society when we do that. We need to have greater funding for indigent defense counsel. And I will just say this, I read the other day that Nick Lyon in his manslaughter case and the Flint water prosecutions, just getting a bind over, which is of course a preliminary exam, a probable cause hearing, $1.5 million has been spent now on his defense, which is more than all the public defenders in Genesee County get paid in an entire year. And I will tell you, having done public defense work on manslaughter cases that went all the way through trial, I would sometimes get paid $1,000, maybe $1,200 to represent people who were poor and could not afford an attorney. But Nick Lyon, $1.5 million, and that's just so far. He hasn't even gone to trial yet. Something is wrong with that system. So what I would say to you all is this. When it comes to matters of juvenile justice, let's just stop pretending that these are stand-alone issues. Let's not pretend that this doesn't have to do with the fact that we pay more in this state on corrections than we do on our children's education, right? We have an attorney general in office right now who has argued that when the emergency manager took over the Detroit public school system and the emergency manager was not providing basic tools of literacy to the children of Detroit, wasn't providing them the proper textbooks or teachers, or warehousing them in schools that were sometimes 40 degrees and had black mold growing from the ceiling and rats in a corner of their classroom. And when they couldn't read and they brought suit, what was the defense by the Michigan Attorney General? It was that Detroit public school children do not have a fundamental right to be taught to read by their state. That there is no right to literacy for public school children. When we have those kinds of arguments being made by our state actors, by our Attorney General, what do we expect the outcome to be for those same children later? When we allow children in the city of Flint, in the city of Detroit, and in other areas to be subjected to lead poisoning at their homes and in their schools, I'm sorry, it is not lead exposure when you drink water that has lead in it. It is lead poisoning. What do we honestly expect their outcomes to be later on for these children? And so I guess what I would say to everyone when we talk about juvenile justice, what does it really mean to bring justice to the children of our state? We have to start caring more, and we have to start investing more in our children's futures than we do in a new hockey arena or in a military parade. You know, we have to care more about the public school system than we do about lining the pockets of Betsy DeVos. We have to, or our kids are going to end up in the correctional system instead of ending up going to college. And so only then, when we really start to make those kinds of investments, can we know that we will be giving the children of this state the opportunities and the futures which they deserve to have. So anyway, thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to you all today. I'm very grateful. I'm very interested in what all the other speakers have to say. And I would like to introduce to you at this time an incredible person that we're really fortunate to have with us today, and that's former Congressman Barney Frank. As many of you know, I'm sure most of you know who he is. Of course, he served over 30 years in Congress. Some of the most important pieces of legislation, I think, to come out of the House of Representatives during his term were either authored by Representative Frank, or he played a very large role in it. And I want to personally thank him, actually, for his work during the housing crisis. Because, of course, as you know, we here in the state of Michigan, we here in the city of Detroit were affected as much, if not more, than any place else in the nation due to the recession, due to the housing crash. And if not for Dodd-Frank, I don't know that we ever would have pulled out of it. I am very hopeful, of course, that some of the more masterful pieces of legislation that Barney Frank was involved in remain on the books and are not repealed, as we're seeing right now, because they are very important pieces of legislation. And I'm very humbled and honored to be able to introduce him. So, Congressman Barney Frank.
Thank you, Dana. I am very glad to be here and address a group of people who are doing the work that I was doing much of my life. You saw me getting up the stairs. I got sort of good news and bad news from my doctors. One is that although I had a quintuple bypass 20 years ago, the improvement in medicine means that I will now live much longer. The flip side of that is that I am apparently going to outlive two things in which I depended for much of my life: newspapers and my spine. And there is no digitalization available for spines that I have yet been told. I thought about some of the work that I did with regard to criminal justice. One area that I take some pride in is that I filed legislation to remove criminal penalties for smoking marijuana in 1972. So I gave the country a little time to catch up, but I think this is now happening. But the one point I want to make is, and I know I get some unhappiness when I say it, you've heard people talk on the merits about criminal justice reform, including juvenile justice reform. Unfortunately, there is a factor that enters into it that I know it's sort of considered, impolite to bring up, but it's partisanship. I wish we could talk about these issues without talking about political partisanship. But I also wish that I could eat more and not gain weight. Ignoring reality gets you in trouble. And the fact is, while there was a period when neither party was doing much about criminal justice, although I had my own Michigan association with that cause from 1998, actually technically until I retired in 2012, I ranked second in seniority to John Conyers on the Judiciary Committee. In fact, in 1998, I became second to John in seniority. I was about fifth in seniority on what was then the Banking Committee. So I figured, well, one of these days, John's going to retire, and I'll be the senior Democrat on Judiciary. So you know what happened to that. But obviously, John Conyers cared a lot about this, as well as some others. In fact, one of the people with whom I served in my first term, some of the older members here will remember, was Judge George Crockett, who was an early passionate advocate of criminal justice reform and an articulate critic of the racism inherent in the system. He told me the time there was some incident and he was then a judge and went down to the police station and released a whole bunch of people, to the consternation of a lot of people who very much deserve to have been consternated. There's a strong partisan issue here, and it's a frustration with regard to Congress in criminal justice in general. Actually, one thing I would say that the criminal justice issue should remind you of, as much as you may be tempted to cheer for Jeff Sessions because the president is yelling at him, he is, in fact, Attorney General Sessions, a major obstacle to sensible criminal justice reform. And in fact, I am encouraged from what I hear from my colleagues and others there that there is a majority in both houses ready to vote for sensible sentencing reform and some other factors. Unfortunately, the internal politics of the Republican Party give a veto to a group of hardliners. And what that means is that who controls the Congress is really a prerequisite to criminal justice reform. Now, I understand people say, oh, well, why are you bringing partisanship into it? I'm not bringing partisanship into it. That's the reality, and it has become more and more so. So I'm obviously supportive of what you do and of the merits and of the strong case you make, but the problem is that all the evidence-based arguments you make about the efficacy of long sentences or sentences at all, you don't get a hearing on that until there is a kind of a prerequisite. So November's coming up, and as I said, I wish we could just deal straight on the merits and ignore partisanship, but that's not possible. And I do think one of the things that's optimistic is, and I think here about marijuana, I think here about same-sex marriage, and I think it's true with criminal justice reform. We have issues, all three of them, and I'll close with this, where there's a very strong logical case for change. But our opponents invoke the fear of unknown results. And they tell you that if you allow better treatment, more sensible treatment of juvenile offenders, just as they said if you let people smoke marijuana and if you let people of the same sex marry, the following terrible consequences will occur. And we get caught in a vicious cycle because people are deterred from being supportive of these things, including some people of goodwill, because they just hear that there are going to be terrible things happening, and they hear this from respectable people. And because they are worried about the consequences, they keep the things from happening. And when they keep the things from happening, we are unable to disprove the negative prediction. Well, obviously, with same-sex marriage, what happened was we were able to disprove the negative predictions. I believe the same is happening with regard to marijuana in a number of states. And the encouraging factor is that if we get some more breakthroughs, and you already have this in other states, on juvenile justice reform, the only, I guess what I would say is this. I regret during some of these earlier debates that we weren't careful enough to take down the specific predictions from our opponents about what terrible things would befall society if this or that happened. Please, as you push for these reforms, take very specific note, take names and times and places and quotes of what they predicted, so that as you are able to achieve some of these reforms, you will have one of the great pleasures of life. And I know, again, there's a convention that you're supposed to pretend that you don't like saying, "I told you so." I have found it's one of the few pleasures that improves with age. I can say, "I told you so," without taking pills before, during, or after I do it. And one of the compensations for the hard work you're doing now, at some point you're going to be able to tell these people who are opposing your efforts to be sensible and help society while being more sensible and compassionate, you're going to have a right to say a great big "I told you so." Don't lose the opportunity to do that, and thank you.
Thank you, Attorney Nessel and Representative Frank. And just to provide a little bit of context for Attorney Nessel's remarks, we invited both candidates from both major parties, candidates for Attorney General, to our convening today, and we were so pleased to have Attorney Nessel with us. To be clear, we are not endorsing any particular candidate, but wanted to extend this invitation to elevate these issues and engage in dialogue. And we're so happy that we're able to do this. I should mention that Representative Tom Leonard, who is the Republican Attorney General candidate, could not join us today, but will in fact be joining us tomorrow, where we will be convening a roundtable on the adult criminal justice system. And that will be co-hosted with the Mackinac Center and the Michigan League for Public Policy, and we're looking forward to having him with us as well. So thank you, both of you. Representative Frank, it was a bonus to have you. I know you were traveling with Attorney Nessel today, and we're so pleased. So I just want to quickly pivot now to do an introduction of our presenters, who will come to the stage in a moment. We are going to be joined by Kevin Bowling, Court Administrator for the 20th Circuit Court in Ottawa County. We have Paul Elam, who's the Chief Strategy Officer for the Michigan Public Health Institute, a new role for him, and Alice Thompson, who's the CEO of Black Family Development. We have given them a very challenging job. Very challenging. And that is to give her an overview of all the topics that we will be doing a deeper dive in our small group sessions. We'll have more time there. But we were literally asking them to tackle the breadth of the juvenile justice system in less than an hour. And so with that, I'm going to get myself on the stage to allow them the opportunity to come and address you. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Apparently, I drew the short straw, and I get to begin. We're thrilled to have this time to talk with you this morning, and we're thankful that you were willing to take the time from your schedules to engage with us on this issue of juvenile justice. Alice, Paul, and I have been tasked with setting the stage by sharing some brief thoughts about 6 juvenile justice reform issues and some of the accompanying challenges. Our first challenge, though, is to limit our comments on each of these issues to about 7 minutes. So let's begin with data, and we'll see if our slides work as we go along. Mark Twain popularized a phrase which he attributed to Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. There are 3 kinds of lies. There are lies, there are damn lies, and there are statistics. Many of us have heard this before and have often laughed or nodded in agreement, and yet this phrase describes part of the challenge we face today as we discuss delinquency and juvenile data. Another thought leader in the management world is Peter Drucker. His writings admonish us that you can't manage what you can't measure, and more recently, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. This is the issue we face with juvenile justice data in Michigan, and it's a stark reminder to all of us as JJ professionals. In fact, the need for data to measure performance and evaluate our efforts extends to all of the issues we will discuss today. By a show of hands, how many of you have ever needed to answer a question but couldn't because you didn't have the data you needed? Quite a few. How many of you had some data, but you didn't have confidence in the accuracy of the data? Even more hands. This is a daily occurrence for those who work in the juvenile justice system, and especially the courts. It isn't that we don't have data, but rather the data resides in multiple systems that were not developed to share information, or the data exists in multiple forms that are incompatible, or the quality of the data is suspect because we lack a common JJ language to define the available data. Part of our reality is that data available to manage juvenile justice system and to conduct research is often compiled by well-meaning staff with little or no training in the importance of consistent and quality data entry, or who are using data elements that are ill-defined and are using a variety of case management systems that are not integrated for appropriate information sharing. This has led to our collective inability to answer very basic questions about the youth engaged in the Michigan juvenile justice system. Simple questions like how many youth are in the JJ system today, or what services or treatment have they received while under our care, or where do they reside? Is it home, detention, foster care, residential placement? I'm certain with more time we could identify several simple yet equally important questions we should be able to easily answer about the young people under our jurisdiction. Some of you may challenge me and say, of course we have that information. Of course we can answer those questions. And I would agree with you that we have case-specific data at the local court and agency level. But neither comprehensive case-level data nor quality aggregate data is readily available at the state level here in Michigan. Unlike some other states, which have made juvenile justice data a priority, providing leadership, clear policy, and adequate funding to address this issue. Of course, having aggregate data at the state level is also critical for research and evaluation. Otherwise, how do we know if our juvenile programs work, or whether they are making our communities safer, or providing rehabilitative services to the youth and families that are relying on us for assistance? This backdrop seems to beg the question, why isn't there a centralized juvenile justice data sharing system in Michigan? My experience tells me it's not because of the lack of technology. The Global Justice Information Sharing Initiative has been working on these technology issues for years, producing standards like the National Information Exchange Model and the Global Reference Architecture, specifically so that technical specification packages can be easily developed, allowing disparate computer systems to talk to each other. It's also not because we lack the beginnings of a common JJ language. A comprehensive juvenile justice data dictionary has been developed by Juvenile Justice Vision 2020, and you, I think, received a copy of it today. The more likely answer is that we have a governance problem. The necessary leaders in the legislative, executive, and judicial branches have not yet come together to declare JJ data collection and information sharing a statewide priority. Perhaps it's because data collection and statistical analysis is often viewed as a long-term process, and this type of system investment must compete with other fiscal priorities that have a more immediate impact. This speaks to policymakers and funding sources looking for immediate short-term solutions when a long-term, more substantial investment may be required for the positive change we recognize as necessary to care for the children engaged with our juvenile justice system. Please understand, my intention is not to point fingers. Rather, it's to encourage all of us to act and to prompt state leaders to partner with us. So why should juvenile justice data be so important to the juvenile courts, juvenile justice stakeholders, legislators, and others? Simply because all of us want to give our youth the best possible opportunity to improve their lives by offering them quality services in a responsible and cost-effective manner. Our need to know is laudable as quality data leads to quality research, and that can guide us toward constant refinement, improvement, and assurance that we are moving in the right direction with our juvenile system. Quality data also guides and supports funding decisions at the state and local level, and research based on quality data can assist with those decisions. The juvenile courts and JJ stakeholders have done a great job in Michigan managing caseloads by reducing residential and detention placements through the use of evidence-based and promising practices, all of which require performance measures and data. However, more work is needed, and the creation of a statewide juvenile justice data system is critical to the further improvement of our high-quality juvenile justice system. What we do in juvenile courts and what JJ stakeholders do matters. It's time our hard work to improve the lives of youth, family, and communities is supported by a robust juvenile justice data sharing system.
Thank you, Kevin. Got it right. Well, good morning to you all. And I will admit that as I stand before you, I am not trying to make you feel good. I want to stir you up. I want to move you to action. So I'm talking about how we can prevent juvenile justice involvement. And we have issues up there that we have to deal with. The adoption and expansion and funding of evidence-based prevention services to improve child welfare and reduce youth violence and involvement in the justice system. And yes, we do have some challenges, and yes, admittedly, those challenges are the elephant in the room. But the elephant can be conquered, and we can do this because we have all the information we need to get it done. But the question for us this morning is, how are the children and youth in Michigan doing? And that should frame our discussion, our decision-making, and our planning. How are they doing? But all the research and data tells us that the children in Michigan are not doing well. And that's a testimony to us as well. If they're not doing well, and we're in this space, it meant that we're not doing the best that we can do on their behalf. If you're getting uncomfortable, I'm achieving my goal. Because I learned in social work that anxiety is growth-inducing. So when your consumers, or those you're servicing, begin to cry and need a tissue, that means you have a breakthrough. They're uncomfortable, and it's growth-inducing. So in terms of how we're doing, the data tells us that Michigan nationally ranks 32nd in the well-being of our children, and we rank last when compared to other Midwest states. And we know from the Michigan 2018 Kids Count data that there are reasons for this. And those reasons dealing with economic risk, because 1 in 5 of our children live in poverty. It also deals with child welfare involvement, and we know that we've had a 30% increase in abuse and neglect from 2010 to 2016. And we also know that our children's education is not what it should be. They're performing poorly in education. The recent MSTEP data that came out this week on our schools reaffirms that our children are not reading by 3rd grade, and that's fundamental, because from birth to 3rd grade, you must learn to read, because from 3rd grade on, you must read to learn. So if you haven't captured that, they're behind right away. And so the recent data also says for children, for their poor school outcomes, that nearly 56% of 3rd graders are not reading at grade level. 65% of children are not college and career ready. And I use a tagline on my email for years that someone said Aristotle said, and it was this: all who have meditated on the art of governing mankind realize that the fate of our nation depends upon the education of our children. So our work is critical. Now, yes, there are challenges, but they can be overcome. And yes, they're the elephant in the room. And here are some challenges. Top one relates to funding. In this work, we know that child care funding is our major source of funding for servicing our kids. But guess what? It does not cover prevention. It will not pay for that. Now, that may be a point for a policy discussion. And so when I was funded to be one of the 5 care management organizations called CMO back in 1999, We had to write our proposal to be funded, and there are 5 of us who are funding. We've been around since the beginning. But they said, what will you do that's creative? And I said, well, I'm going to use, which was not popular then, a place-based approach. I'm going to focus on my 9 zip codes and begin to organize a community. So I chose zip code 48205 because at that time, it had the highest incidence of youth crime, and it had more children in that zip code than any place in Michigan in terms of zip codes. So I chose that. I'm going to work with the community. I'm going to build community capacity. I'm going to work with schools and the families. I'm going to help establish block clubs. When we got funded with Child Care Fund, I could not do that because it would not pay for that. So that wild dream of mine was on hold. But a few years later, the Skillman Foundation initiated the Good Neighbors Initiative, and they chose one of the zip codes that was mine, zip code 48205. So I got deeply involved in that. And getting involved in that, the neighborhood residents chose one goal for that neighborhood for a 10-year project. And that goal was families will have all the support and resources they need to make their children successful in life. So how would they do that? And they said, we need organized block clubs. And so I raised my hand and said, that's my dream. And so Skillman Foundation funded us to do the work in this zip code. So our outcomes are a part of child care funding, but also the philanthropic community. And I would say this, our major thought leaders in solving problems have not been our government. Our major thought leaders have been our philanthropic community. So hands out to them. Now, other challenges, the lack of evidence-based services. And we know that they work. And so the lack of those services and lack of having good data is part of our challenge. The other challenge is the lack of coordination among child caring organizations. And I'll speak more about that. One of the challenges is this: we talk about collaboration, but few of us can really define collaboration. Sometimes we say we're collaborating, but we're cooperating. Or we say we're collaborating, but we're coordinating. So on the continuum of working together, you begin with cooperation, coordination, and collaboration. You want to achieve the collaboration point because that's where things get done. Now, collaboration is hard. And here are the challenges around collaboration. It's around trust, it's around leadership, it's around power, it's around control, it's around competition. But we could overcome all those things. But key to our work is collaboration. What are some other things that we have to look at? And that is children's well-being. Think about this. When we service children, we focus on their problems, their challenges, their deficits, and we try sometimes to be strength-based, but we get back to their problems. I'm going to contend that our focus should be on how do we improve the youth and children's well-being. That should be our focus. Our intervention should be on well-being, not on their problems. And I'm going to say kudos to Mr. Brooks of the Detroit Women's Health Authority, because as he has taken over, he has charged those of us who are in this work with mental health. He has said, we're shifting now at this level to move from being funders of care to being managers of care. And kudos, because he's challenged us to say this: I want you now to focus squarely on the well-being of your consumers. He identified those 5 domains, and he's pushing that. That's transformational work. And those well-being domains are physical health, behavior health, social well-being, spiritual well-being, economic well-being. So think about that. Think about it. In our treatment planning, our focus was on how to achieve these well-being outcomes for those whom we serve. And so kudos to him. So in our work, what are our well-being categories? Perhaps social connectedness, safety and stability, mastering of tasks. These are not mine, I borrowed these from someplace. Access to relevant resources. Let's think about focusing our work in the prevention area on the well-being of children. So can we reduce the involvement of kids in the jail system? Yes, we can. We have all the data. We have the research The issue for us is, do we have the will, the compassion, and the drive to make things happen? And so, yes, the elephant's in the room, and the elephants are big, but I will tell you this, we always win when we work together. And I'll leave you with an African proverb that says this. It tells us how powerful we are and how much we can achieve. And the proverb says this: working together, the ants eat the elephant, and we win. Thank you.
Good morning, family. So I have the challenge to talk about diversion, and I think the number one issue in this space is that we need to find a way to establish a statewide mechanism to ensure that the right youth come into contact with our juvenile justice system. First and foremost, I think we have to really raise up the issue of collateral consequences when our youth come into contact with the justice system. And what do I mean by collateral consequences? We have set up a system where if a youth is adjudicated, I think we heard earlier this morning, that experience will follow them for the rest of their life. A collateral consequence might limit a youth's ability to join the military, to pursue higher education, to obtain housing, secure employment, or just qualify for simple state and federal entitlements. And the whole notion of diversion is to make sure that the appropriate youth move deeper into the system, and those who shouldn't be in the system should have opportunities to address their underlying causes of delinquency. And that really starts with risk and needs assessment. We consistently see that we have youth who are moving deep into our system who are not moderate or high risk, who don't have high needs. These are youth who somehow have gotten connected in our system because we're not using appropriate risk and needs assessment, objective decision making, or we've not thought about non-compliance issues. When youth enter into our diversion programs, due to non-compliance, we don't have a full continuum of care, and so their lack of compliance with our diversion programs push them deeper into the system because we haven't planned accordingly. And so diversion really ensures that we keep low-risk youth from being mixed with moderate to high-risk youth and reduce the likelihood that these youth will learn new criminal behaviors and increase our recidivism rates. So one of the challenges we have in Michigan is that many of our diversion models that are currently in place require a formal petition. The whole goal is to keep a youth's record out of the system. And we've created something where they actually have a formal record. In this day and age of technology, we know that we share data often. And the court's intention may be to keep that information away from the public, but once that information is out there, even if we delete that record, many of these collateral consequences end up tracking our youth. So we have to find a way to implement diversion as intended to make sure that we don't have these records following youth when they participate in our diversion programs. We have another issue, which I think we've coined the term justice by geography. I call it inequitable treatment of youth because we're not providing these diversion opportunities for all of our youth, irregardless of where they live within our state of Michigan. And so some jurisdictions have diversion programs at multiple decision points. We have law enforcement diversion, prosecutorial diversion, some informal diversion. Many steps in other jurisdictions don't have diversion at all. So a youth in Wayne County, for example, might engage in a behavior, and a youth over in Berrien County is engaging in the same type of behavior. Our system responds totally different. And so one youth is in a diversion program and is provided the opportunity not to move deeper into the system, and that other youth is not provided that opportunity. And so that is a challenge upon us. How do we say we're creating equitable opportunities for youth in this diversion space? We need to come up with a statewide mechanism to make sure that all youth have that opportunity. And then I think lastly, we need to think about a full continuum of care that assumes there will be non-compliance. I've got 5 kids in my household, 3 of them are boys, and daily they do things that I don't ask them to do. And so I don't just come home and tell them to pack their stuff, you're getting out of here. I assume there will be some noncompliance, and I deal with graduated sanctions that I would like to really encourage them. And the first thing starts with sort of taking things away from them, not locking them up and not throwing them out of my house. And so because we live in a place where we have limited resources, we have a challenge of building a continuum of care, something that we actually need to walk our youth through. Not you were in a diversion program this month and 5 months later we track you down and you're locked up in a facility. Many of our communities have a continuum that looks like that. So those are three challenges I think we have to look at as a community to make sure that we can advance good diversion policy practice, get these recommendations before our elected officials, and make sure we continue to work with them to advance that work.
We're halfway through the issues. The fourth issue we're exploring today is the use of evidence-based practices to reduce delinquency. Simply put, evidence-based practice is the conscientious use of the current best evidence in making decisions about the juveniles and families we serve. It includes the integration of expert opinion, external scientific evidence, and client values to provide high-quality services reflecting interests, values, needs, and the choices of the individuals we serve. In Michigan, the clear majority of juvenile cases flow through the courts, either through diversion, the consent calendar, or the formal processing of delinquency petitions. The juvenile courts then engage with community service providers through contracts and partnerships in the process of rehabilitating delinquent youth. Community-based programs outside the courts are also critical to the effective outcomes for youth. Research is helping to establish treatment strategies and programming that effectively change delinquent behavior and improve risk reduction in delinquent youth and reduce reoffense and help young people succeed. In Michigan, these strategies, which demonstrate evidence-based programs work, have been increasingly employed among juvenile courts and within our communities, which is great news for all of us. The courts have implemented such strategies and programs and have advanced the level of success in their local juvenile justice systems. However, more work needs to be done. In part, the expansion of evidence-based practices depends on creating awareness and familiarity with these programs that hold promise among the juvenile courts and their stakeholders. The courts, private agencies, and community partners are often willing to engage in implementing new programs if they've been exposed to positive evaluations and they're familiar with the programs. A good example of this that Paul just referred to was the use of criminogenic risk needs assessments. The use of valid assessment tools are slowly but increasingly being implemented throughout Michigan. There are 83 counties served by 57 circuit courts with juvenile justice jurisdiction in Michigan, and the percentage of courts using assessment tools is gradually increasing. However, training staff and developing infrastructure to effectively manage the data are also critical to program success. It is not good enough to simply require court staff to complete a criminogenic assessment using a validated tool. Rather, the court staff then needs to use the scores in each domain assessed to drive the programming that meets the individualized need of the juvenile. When implemented properly, this is a powerful tool for the youth, the parents, and the courts. Evidence-based and promising practices can also provide alternatives to detention. Many courts in Michigan have significantly reduced the reliance on juvenile detention by changing their culture from strict order enforcement through graduated sanctions, perhaps some of those that Paul was using with his boys, to addressing a juvenile's behavior in community settings. Although the use of graduated sanctions certainly has its place, there is increasing evidence that responding with certainty versus severity may be more effective. In other words, it's imperative that a juvenile's behavior is addressed with certainty, but it doesn't mean every youth who does something wrong needs to be put in detention. There are many other approaches and consequences that will have much more meaning to that youth. Other evidence-based programs you may be familiar with include things like multisystemic therapy, family functional therapy, effective practices and community supervision, or EPICS, thinking for a change, regression replacement training, mentoring, START program for sex offender treatment, and these are just a few of many of the programs which have been developed and evaluated for positive results and positive outcomes with at-risk youth. Of course, the successful implementation of evidence-based programs requires significant staff training and data collection to maintain program fidelity, as well as adequate funding at the state and local level. We were asked, as we talked about some of these issues, to try to tell you a story. Perhaps Tony's story will help illustrate how evidence-based programs can effectively be used to change delinquent behavior. And as you hear about Tony, perhaps you'll remember some other cases where you had similar successes. Tony was a teenager in a Cambodian family that was experiencing significant cultural difficulties as recent immigrants, as well as financial difficulties due to his father losing his job and his mother becoming ill. Even though Tony was in school and working part-time, he knew his family needed more money to survive. So naturally, as the eldest son, he felt it was his responsibility to provide that money his family desperately needed. With few options, he eventually turned to a local gang for the two things he needed: acceptance and money. When I recently spoke with Tony at a community gathering, he laughed about his first contact with the police because it was for smoking on the street. Soon afterwards, things escalated when law enforcement heard a rumor that Tony was carrying a gun. Police searched and found the weapon on Tony. As his family needs increased, Tony began making lots of money selling drugs for the gang, and eventually the product line changed from drugs to guns. Guns that were stolen and then sold to gangs in Chicago. After burglarizing a gun shop and stealing a large quantity of guns, Tony was arrested and he was lodged in our detention center. While in detention, Tony participated in aggression replacement training and thinking for a change. Following disposition, the court needed to remove Tony from the community for his own safety from the gang. We used our evidence-based alternatives to detention program, what we call juvenile community justice, placing Tony in a foster home with an active caseworker, wraparound services, mentoring, and much more. Through consistent services and building positive relationships, Tony learned a new life away from the gang was possible. Tony received lots of support from his foster home, school, and church, and was not stigmatized for his prior gang involvement. A complicating factor, though, was that Tony missed his family. But as part of the security plan, only the judge and the caseworker knew where the foster home was. So 2 to 3 times a week, the caseworker transported Tony's family to a neutral location simply so they could maintain a family bond. After 9 months under court jurisdiction and participating in a variety of evidence-based programs, Tony established a roadmap for his future. He wanted to go to college and become a nurse. Later, while in school, he changed majors, graduated, and is now working for a logistics company. At 24 years of age, Tony has never reoffended, is gainfully employed, and was recently married. So as you can see, the use of evidence-based programs is not magic. But to be successful, it does require our hard work, critical thought, adequate funding, staff training, and the motivation to serve the youth and families seeking our support.
I'm always proud when I do this correctly. So I'm going to talk about expanding community-based care for juveniles involved. And so one of my favorite programs, and my staff know this at the agency, is family preservation, community-based services, and community engagement. I love engaging the community. And so we know what the issues are. I'll have you read this. I won't repeat them. What our limitations are in trying to really expand community-based services. But all the research tells us that community-based services work. They produce the best outcomes for our children. Research also tells you, you've heard this morning already, is that sometimes when we confine children and involve them in things like boot camp or intensive confinement, we really do reinforce delinquent behavior. And so let's use the wisdom that we have. And so while we have made some progress, and tremendous progress in Michigan, and kudos to that, we have closed 11 facilities. We only have about 2 left open. We have reduced kids coming into care by at least 50%, at least in Wayne County, and thousands across Michigan. But although we have done that, we still remain 6th highest in confining youth and out-of-home care. The question is, why is that? The other issue that we do know is that we're one of only 4 remaining states that consider a 17-year-old as an adult. Now, while we're waiting on information to go to 18, that is not good enough. And this is why it's not. Because brain research and science have told us that a developing brain for good decision-making and executive function happens at 20. So why are we selling for 18? This is not to make you feel good or you feel comfortable. That 18 is great progress, but an 18-year-old brain is still a child's brain. The executive function and judgment is not there. Research tells us it happens at age 20. So let's try and make it 20 at some point in time. Judge Kelly, and I love you. 18 is good now, it's better. It's progress. So what are our limitations in trying to increase community-based options? There are a few. The limitation, of course, is our funding. And I mentioned child care funding, which is not paying for prevention. It will pay for some community-based care, but on conditions. And those conditions are the child still has to somewhat dabble with the court system. Perhaps not a petition in Wayne County, but still some court involvement with that. And so that's an issue for us in terms of funding. The other issue is that there's no incentive that really cause someone to begin to focus on community-based care. In some jurisdictions, you can just simply use out-of-home care as your rehabilitation method, and that's occurring in some jurisdictions. Other limitations, racial and other disparities still exist, and we know that. Children of color, not just in Michigan, across the country, overrepresented in child welfare system and also in the JJ system. Here's some data. Over a quarter of confined victims are African Americans in the welfare system, who, while they're a quarter of the confined victim, they only make up 18% of 0 to 7 population in Michigan. And also, a recent study in Michigan said that in residential placement, 2/3 of those youth are children of color, while they're only 1/5 of the state's population. Something is wrong with that data. So we have to ask ourselves, how are we making decisions about children of color? And oftentimes what I see is that sometimes when they have mental illness and trauma, that gets criminalized. Rather than going to the mental health system, they go to the juvenile justice system. And once they get there, they are stuck. It's hard to get them out. They need mental health care. The other issue we have is the lack of legal services for our children. And so we know that, like adults, children constitutionally must have legal representation. But in some of these systems that we have them in, they do not have lawyers. Or if they do have lawyers, they're ill-equipped and not trained in this area. So that's a barrier as well. And so I'm going to do mine quickly and be less than 7 minutes like you asked me to, right? There's also a lack of reinvesting in our community. And while we have closed 11 facilities that were very expensive, we have not reinvested in not only prevention services, best practice, but community-based care as well. We have not done that. And so we must challenge that as well. And I'm going to say, even in Wayne County, we have had tremendous success. The CMOs, and we have a few here, so raise your hand, my colleagues, are doing amazing work. The juvenile justice system, amazing work we're doing. And we have been able to reduce recidivism from as high as 56%, I think, in 1999 to 11% in 2016. But I recall when we were at 7 and 8% in 2006, at 8%. We lost that because we lost some funding for some best practice models because changing and funding shifted. And when it shifts, you cannot afford best practice programs because they require model fidelity. And so I would push us to always advocate for appropriate funding for our children. So those are limitations that we have as well. And so what I would tell you as we think about doing this work, that we have all that we need to make a difference in the lives of our youth and our children. We have all that we need. We have to have the courage and the boldness to stick to it and make it happen. And so this quote was posed to me in a group some years ago. And I'm going to leave you with this final quote from me as well. And the question that we have to answer for ourselves in this group is, what are we going to do about all this information? We got lots of research, and we do have data. So we're not lacking in information. So what are we going to do? So here's the question. How do we advocate to ensure appropriate policies, practices, and funding and make the best decision for all children, youth in the state of Michigan? And secondly, how do we ensure that we're providing the best programs and services to our youth to receive the care, support, nurturing, and responsive relationship they need to develop in healthy ways and to achieve all aspects of their unique well-being? We have a unique role to play here today. In your small session, you'll begin to have discussions about that. And so we can do all that we need to do by working together with unity of purpose. So I'll leave you with this other African quote that I use often, and it's called, "In the spirit and joy of Harambe." You can do all that you want to do in the spirit and joy of Harambe, and that means we all pull together in a unity of purpose. Thank you.
Okay, last but not least, reentry and aftercare. We have another challenge to fund and establish a statewide mechanism to ensure that youth are prepared to succeed upon release from residential institutions throughout our state, out of state, and that our communities also have the funding to provide ongoing services to support youth and families in their natural environments. I think two of the things that we find often are defunded are evaluation and aftercare. For some reason, we have developed a practice where we finally get a youth on track. We're providing interventions that work, and we say, you're no longer under our jurisdiction, we're going to stop what's been working. And the challenge for aftercare is, how do we provide the funding and resources to continue those things that have been successful, but not keep a kid and their family connected with our justice system, right? That's the natural environment piece. The second piece on the front end is really thinking about how we create better youth, better citizens to return to safer neighborhoods once we understand that they're going to be sentenced to a residential facility. And our old historical practice has been about starting that work 30 to 60 days prior to that youth actually being released, and reentry is really about starting that work upon entry into that facility. And so we've laid out 4 phases here, and in those 4 phases, it's really going back to administering good risk and needs assessment. While we have this youth, what do we really need to be working with this youth on? What are the priorities, whether they be related to their needs or risks? Providing responsive programming to those needs that are identified, not sort of using cookie cutter approaches. We only provide this type of program for all youth. No, it's really addressing the underlying needs of those actual youth while we have them within our facilities. And then preparing for transition by working with our community partners and providing in-reach services to make sure that that youth is prepared for transition back into the community. And lastly in that continuum is really aftercare services. We don't just sort of shut off a service provision model once that youth is no longer under the jurisdiction of the court, but we need to work with our community partners to make sure we have models to continue to support that youth. I think one of the challenges is that we really have no policy requirement in our state or any statewide funding mechanism to facilitate reentry. In the adult system, we came together years ago and found a way to make that happen, and I think we can do it in our juvenile justice system. There are different challenges, but we have models that work. Michigan is noted for the great work that we've done around reentry. The state of Michigan actually has an evidence-based model that was borrowed from Ohio that is available for us to actually utilize, and so it's educating our jurisdictions on those resources that might be available. I raise equity again because we don't have a statewide policy or funding mechanism. Some youth have access to aftercare and reentry, some youth don't. The evidence tells us that when we provide support to youth when they transition, they're actually going to do better. And so all of our youth should have access to these types of services. As was just mentioned, the state has this evidence-based model that's been made available, and we need to make sure that our jurisdictions are utilizing that framework, that we get in the room and understand what that actually means. And so what happens after we close a case from the juvenile justice system and a youth is no longer under our jurisdiction of the court? It's incumbent upon us to make sure that those resources are actually in our communities.
Terrific. Thank you, Kevin, Paul, and Alice for that overview and getting us through a comprehensive amount of information in a short amount of time.